There will always be people, movement who are fighting for democracy.
So this is what it is to be in front of the stage lights. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I hope that you had an interesting couple of hours, that you've managed to share ideas and brainstorm some new ones. We will begin this afternoon session with a short presentation on the global state of democracy indices, which served as the main evidence base for the report. As we tried to explain before, our indices can be used for a more holistic and nuanced analysis of democracy. The indices were conceptualized and developed together with an outstanding number of external partners, and we are very glad to welcome some of them here today. Professor Sven-Erik Skanning from Aarhus University, who will give us a short introduction on what these indices measure. Welcome up on stage. Professor Claudio Tufiș from the University of Bucharest, and Anna Luhrmann, Senior Research Fellow from the Varieties of Democracy Institute, VDEM, who will afterwards facilitate a short discussion here on stage. Welcome up.
Yeah. So, thank you. So this has really been a collective effort to create this database, new database on democracy. On top of Claudio Tufiș, we have had internal people from International IDEA helping us, and we have had an international advisory board, including some of the leading scholars in the world on measuring democracy, to help us both on the conceptual part, but also with the measurement part of creating this database on democracy. So what we offer is a new database on different aspects of democracy, covering 155 countries. That is basically all the countries in the world with more than 1 million inhabitants. And it is based on no less than 98 different indicators drawn from 14 different data sets. And it's a conscious choice by us to really draw on all the many kinds of rich sources that are already out there and to combine them into a more precise and valid measurement of different aspects of democracy. All of these measures for the 5 attributes and the 16 sub-attributes, they range from 0, which is kind of the lowest level of performance in a particular area, to 1, which is the best performing level. And we really hope that this will be of use both for academics and practitioners, students, journalists alike, and maybe even ordinary citizens interested in political matters such as this. With regard to the database, I would also like to emphasize, as it was already said this morning, that all this data is available online. They have created a wonderful interface that you can interact with. So if you have an interest in a particular region of the world, a particular country, some particular time periods, this is all available to you online. If you're also a little bit nerdy like me and Claudio, you can also download the whole data set and play around with it as you see fit yourself. I'll make this very brief because I think many of the details and the advantages of our dataset compared to alternatives will be clear to us after our discussion with Anna.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sven-Erik. So, we all know that there are a lot of measures of democracy out there and also a lot of concepts of democracy. Like if you put scholars on democracy in one room, I'm sure they won't agree on one definition. So how did you decide which concepts and which indicators to use?
You are exactly right. There are already many alternatives, and you're also exactly right that scholars tend to disagree about these issues, both the conceptual part and the measurement part. And I can assure you we had our discussions both internally in the group, but also with our external advisory board, and all this publication has also been through external review process. So yeah, we have had a lot of cross-checking about these things. But our starting point for this whole endeavor has been international ideas. A conceptual framework was called the State of Democracy. But we had to modify it a little bit in order to make it fit for quantitative measurement. And the next stage was then when we agreed about the overall understanding of democracy and all the kind of sub-attributes of democracy we would like to measure, was to try to find available empirical indicators that would tap into these concepts. And we started out with several hundreds, and do quality checks and making sure that both they were of high quality, but also that they would cover all the countries and years that we had of interest. Then we had a selection and came down to 98.
Okay. And Claudio, so how do you think the indices you came up with are different from other democracy measures that are already there?
Well, there are probably 2 or 3 different characteristics that I think are advantages of the global state of democracy indices by comparison to the existing ones. The first one is, I would say, this rigorous academic background that it has behind the data. As Sven-Erik already mentioned, we've started from a large number of indicators. We discussed which ones might be available and which ones do not fit our criteria. But all of this was based on a theoretical framework, starting from the state of democracy framework of international ideas, and then updated with basically raising it to the country level and doing it as a quantitative approach. A different advantage of our indices by comparison to others, with most of the others, so Videm, for instance, is in the same category as us, from that perspective, is the fact that we do have estimates that take into account the uncertainty. Measuring democracy is difficult, and never believe somebody who says the score for democracy for this particular country is 7.3. That's never the case. You have to take into account the uncertainty. There's errors in the data, there's interpretations, different definitions, and we do account in some way, in a statistical way for these kind of differences, trying to make sure that we also show the uncertainty regarding these estimates, which is interesting. And as you play around with the data and you visualize the data, you will find out those confidence intervals and you will see what we're talking about. So that's I would say probably the 2 most important aspects where our indices differ from the existing ones. Then there's this evolution of measures of democracy over time. The first one, if I remember correctly, it's the Freedom House score that appeared around 1975 or so. So that was an index that was developed by only 2 persons, coding for each country, for each year, various aspects of democracy. Nowadays we have probably around 10, 15, 20 different measures of democracy, from Freedom House to Polity4, which is better known to political scientists, to the Economist Intelligence Unit, to Bertelsmann Transformation Index. So you have a wide array of democracy measures. This one is probably, I would say, one of the most developed in terms of the number of people that are behind the data, that have been working on the data, and that have been devising the whole index from theory to coming up with the final numbers. And I'll stop here. Otherwise, I'll tend to talk too much.
No, it's a good overview. So, particularly now, thinking about all the other democracy measures that are out there, in particular Freedom House has been accused quite a lot of Western bias and of scoring Western countries systematically better than, for example, more social, democratic, socialist countries. So how do you think, Sven-Erik, or how did you deal with this topic, and how did you ensure that this is not the case with the global state of democracy indices?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So what we did is, well, first of all, as we already explained, we had a really careful selection of indicators that we draw on for measuring democracy. So all these different criteria would basically, to a large extent, rule out the different kinds of biases that we would face for some indicators. But also just a conceptual basis that we work with means that we go beyond this classical liberal understanding of democracy that it has been dominant in the West, and supplement that with a kind of a supplementary perspective of democracy that will also emphasize social and economic rights, active citizen engagement in politics and elsewhere in civil society, etc., but also quality of government, good governance would be captured. So we go beyond the kind of classical Western understanding. So people, no matter, I would say, if it's kind of within reasonable limits, of course, the understanding of democracy that you have, we capture most of it in our data set.
And then there are also non-Western people involved in generating the data, right?
Yes, so what we have done is to draw on existing data sources that are out there. But for example, one of our main sources is from the Varieties of Democracy project and a lot of their indicators. And many of their indicators are based on expert surveys, and what Varieties of Democracy basically insist on, at least as a rule of thumb, is that you have a majority of native coders coding the countries. So in that way, also there is a kind of a local engagement, and it reflects the things on the ground from people that actually know what's going on in the countries.
Speaking of VDEM, one question that I'm often hear when people ask me about VDEM is how it's actually possible to compare so fundamentally different countries, like let's say North Korea and Germany, on a numerical scale, and how do you ensure that these numbers actually say something?
Well, whenever we do compare, I'll start first with the binary definition. We more or less know just by observation whether a country is a democracy or not. So that's the starting point usually. You have a binary choice. It's either democratic or it's not. So from that perspective, it's easy to say if Germany is democratic or not, it is. It's easy to say if North Korea is democratic or not, it's not. And the challenge goes when we try to move from this binary selection to trying to place various countries on a continuum that tries to show either, as some other data sets are showing, a certain level of democracy, or regardless of how it is defined, or as we are doing here, we are focusing on dimensions of democracy, attributes of democracy. So that's the challenge that we had to do to place these countries. Now, of course, if you take any possible pair of countries, you might agree with some of the positions that they have on a various dimension attribute. You might disagree with some, but overall, when we aggregate these numbers using statistical methods, you somehow realize that you can reach probably a consensus from the users of data. So the idea is to focus on the relative positions, and this is probably the one aspect that I should emphasize in here. We are looking at 0 to 1 scales. 0 does not mean the perfect absence of a particular attribute. 1 does not mean that you have the maximum that you could have on a particular attribute. 0 means that is the lowest score that it is available in the data, and 1 means that is the best performance of a country in the 40 years that we have in our data set from 1975 to 2015. So 1 does not mean that that country has reached perfection, everything is done, we solved democracy, everything is good from now on. No, you still have to fight for advancing and reaching that I don't want to go into political theory now, but reaching that ideal of what democracy is or should be. And then I don't even want to go into the question of defining democracy, because whenever you have 2 political scientists in a room, they're going to fight over 3 or 4 definitions.
And what did you actually do to check if the measures are valid and reliable?
Well, you can look at that in various ways, and just as an example, I was talking to Sven Erik earlier. When I was looking at the first beta version of the data visualization, I just printed the lines for Romania and Poland on civil society participation and asked my colleagues to identify the two countries just based on the lines. And knowing the evolution of civil society in Poland with the solidarity and the strikes, and then with the military, they were able to identify the country. So that is one form of validity, external validity. You have the experience that you have of the countries. It's basically telling you that the data is correct. Then we did a series of more or less complex statistical checks. We looked over how the evolution of the indicators went over the years. We also did some correlations with existing indicators that are not included in our data set. So that was more or less another form of validity. And then it's just the statistical methods that were used for combining the indicators into the aggregate scores, attributes. But I don't think that's. I mean, I don't want to bore you with equations and derivations and integrals.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You want to add something, or?
Yeah, I have a small point on that. So another way we can check the data, the quality of the data, is if we for one or a few countries have very good data for maybe a limited time period, we can see if the patterns or the trends as shown with our data tends to be in agreement with the data points we have that are really sophisticated and so on. But unfortunately, we don't have this very rich data for all countries maybe, but then we can have a higher confidence in the data when there's an overlap in this way.
And why do you think that this exercise is actually important? Why should we care about putting a number on the quality of democracy?
So it is the thing with numbers that it can systematize our thinking and the way we treat information. So when you put numbers on a phenomenon, it actually provides a tool for you that you can use for more or less sophisticated analysis. So for example, if you want to look at trends within a country or in a region or something like that, it's really hard to do if you don't have any numbers to work with. And if you want to really go all in and do some research on this, using some very big comparisons of countries over many years and so on, there's really no way around using numbers as the ones that we have in our database.
And when you were working with the data, was there anything that you found particularly surprising, or any trends that you saw that you think mainly this data helped you to uncover?
Well, I haven't had the pleasure yet because we've been so occupied building the database to actually go into doing the research part of it. But it has been really fascinating, to move beyond what is normally considered the kind of core aspects of democracy, such as elections, but also to include corruption and gender equality and many other issues, and look at the developments there. Because in many of these respects, I would say that our data set is one of the first really to have a very comprehensive coverage of some of these previously neglected issues.
There's one more element in here that, well, it was not surprising, but I think it's interesting and it shows the direction to go, and that's the availability of data. As we come closer to the present, we started in 1975. As we come closer to the present, we do have more and more data sources available. We do have more people interested in measuring particular aspects of democracy. And I think that in the future, if we will focus on a shorter period of time coming to the present, we will be able to construct even more complex models, data sets, that will take into account, for instance, as was talked in the morning session, the effect of artificial intelligence, TI, everything on how democracy is developing. So, yeah, looking forward to how new and more complex data can be integrated into a newer version of this.
And what do you envision? How could this data be used in general? Like how for different people? Like Do you think also general citizens can use this data? How can governments use it?
Yeah, I think this is suitable for many purposes, for many people and organizations. So one way to use this data is for educational purposes, both kind of even down to elementary school, I would say. So what do we know about this country? How many women are in parliament in this country? So this is a easy, quick access to many issues related to democracy that could inform people at many levels, also high schools and also university level. Speaking of universities, of course, the students there have to go from being kind of more pupils to students to actually kind of mini researchers. So it's also, we hope that this will be used by academics to do more sophisticated analysis. And somewhere in between, we have journalists, government organizations, civil society organizations also, that for one or the other reasons have an interest in looking at how different countries or regions are doing on different aspects of democracy, and they can be informed by our data.
And do you see also opportunities for governments or international development?
Yeah, well, generally governments look at this kind of reports quite anxiously, and whenever they find good news, they emphasize that, oh, we are looking very good on this particular one. Whenever they find not so good news, they probably ignore it or tend to play on some other strengths they identify. So that's definitely use for that on the government side. But I want to emphasize what Sven-Erik already said, the civil society use of this kind of instruments, because they have the advantage of being able to analyze properly what's going on in the data and putting pressure on the governments to try and somehow improve where there's things to be improved. So I've seen it numerous times when civil society organizations are using data that's already existing, and I hope that they will use the Global State of Democracy Indices as well from now on, to identify areas where a particular country is lagging behind. And they can do that by comparing themselves to other countries that they use as models. So it depends from country to country. Romania, and I'm going to give an example from my own country, whenever Romania has a score like this coming up, they automatically compare themselves to Hungary and Bulgaria. I'm pretty sure in Scandinavian countries also have their own pairings and that works out everywhere the same, I think. So civil society organizations, I think, will benefit a lot from having an additional tool to justify their agendas. And then if the governments want to use this, they're more than welcome to do that. They have the knowledge, the how to use it. So I hope that they will use it as well, especially to make sure that they have evidence-based policies that they are proposing.
Yeah. So you can say in order to make a change, you need three things. You need willingness, you need ability, and you need knowledge. So we help provide some of the knowledge, and then we, of course, need other people to provide the willingness and the ability to carry things through. But there is some very recent research that has been published showing in the area of human trafficking, when the US State Department started issuing reports on this in this area, it actually has had an impact on how many countries have performed. So actually, it was they helped flag some problems that were not emphasized before, and it seems to have made a difference with this greater awareness.
I think this is a great final statement, saying that knowledge can help us to make a change. So I hope that the Global State of Democracy Indices will help to facilitate change towards democracy, and maybe we can continue more. We can also ask if there are questions in the audience, maybe towards the indices. And now you have basically the unique opportunity to talk to the two main experts who are behind these indices. If there's anything you want to know regarding the methodology or the conceptual choices behind, or how you can use it, you're more than welcome to. Oh yeah, there's one.
Hello. Hi, I just have one question, and that is, have you reflected on the ability for authoritative governments to use data for negative purposes to, for instance, see how policies can increase fear and reduce political participation? Thank you.
Yeah. So of course, knowledge can also be abused and not used only for good purposes. But I would like to emphasize that both our database in itself, but also in the general report, is very much kept on a descriptive level. So we are not establishing very strong links between different components of our democracy. Or it's never stated explicitly how the different means could be used in order to undermine democracy. It's more kept on a descriptive level. But of course, this is a kind of a two-edged sword, and we know when we had the color revolutions, for example, in former communist countries, the student movements in different countries learned from each other, and they helped topple authoritative governments. But it didn't take long before also, of course, the autocrats learned from that experience and started communicating with each other about how to prevent these things. But I think these things are simply too important and too interesting to keep a secret just for the purpose that it could be abused by some dictators.
Any other questions?
Hey, Uzair Khan. Thank you for detailed explanations. And maybe this is a superficial question, but I still kind of wanted to ask. Looking at the variables, I would say that there are many variables that are used in similar researches. And as you know, quality of governance is also one of them, one of the other major data sources that we are using. If you may say, what is the difference, like what is the global state of democracy adds to the literature? What is the difference? Or, yeah.
Okay, I'll let Sven-Erik talk about the conceptualization behind, because he's the brains behind that. What it brings new to the table, in addition to offering these uncertainty coefficients, and in addition to offering this perspective that does not focus on a particular definition of democracy, it offers various aspects of democracy, these attributes that people can then play with, and then can combine them using different ways to identify how a country performs on a particular understanding of democracy. So those would be probably the main additions that global state of democracy brings to the literature. And then, of course, it never hurts to have multiple measurements for a phenomenon that's as complex as democracy is. You can analyze, you can put all the different existing measures of democracy, including ours, and then you can compare how they can explain various associations if you want to go that particular route, for instance. So it never hurts to have as many measures as possible, because there's always going to be some overlap between them, and there's always going to be some uniqueness that's particular to a specific measure, and that's again part of what global state of democracy will add to. Now it's up to researchers, I would say mostly researchers of democracy, to see exactly which particular aspects are overemphasized or underemphasized in each of the measures that are available.
Yeah. So one of the things where we differ from most of the alternatives is not only this very comprehensive understanding of democracy and including some other aspects, because these other aspects could also be covered by other data sets that would say, well, we don't focus on democracy per se, but we focus on quality of government, as you mentioned yourself. But what we do is to actually, we have really carefully browsed all the alternative data sets, and we combine them in a way that hasn't been done before. So using some very sophisticated statistical tools, we use, for example, 4 different indicators to measure one thing. And in that way, we get both a more precise and we think also a more valid measure of a particular phenomenon. So for example, with regard to gender equality, you can have 2 or 3 different indicators on that, but only after combining them, we can have more certainty about our estimates.
Are there more questions? Yeah.
Just a last question from my side. We have the framework of the SDGs, and we all have been fighting, I think also the Swedish governments and other friends have been fighting to have an SDG that would relate to the quality of democratic governance. And of course, democracy was beyond what was possible. I think from a diplomatic and political point of view, we have the phrasing about accountable institutions. Are you in any way involved or connecting to this very big effort to be produced by the international community to now that we have this decision on the SDGs, including 16, to see with the data community how this can be year after year measured? Is there any interaction with the UN or other institutions on that?
Well, I think a person more integrated in international ideas should say that, but I know that Anna has been heavily involved in working with the SDGs, so yeah. Could you?
So maybe I'll jump out of my moderator role for a second and take that question, because actually, so my work in the Varieties of Democracy Institute, we have worked quite closely with relevant people, mainly at the United Nations Development Program, and we also had a meeting in New York, organized actually by the representation of International IDEA in New York, talking about how the specific indicators of the Varieties of Democracy Institute can be used to monitor progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Because as you know, the whole idea behind the MDG process and now the SDG process is really to try to come up with a development agenda that we can monitor, where we can actually say, have countries made progress over years? So I think it's really of utmost importance to identify concrete indicators that monitor specific goals. And you were right in pointing out that democracy is not explicitly mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals, but in the SDG 16 we find a lot of specific aspects and targets that are closely related to democracy, like on accountable institutions. And here we have suggested a broad realm of VDEM indicators, the same for representative institutions, so the question of how many women are represented, for example. There we also have VDEM indicators that we suggested in the process, also in front of the UN Statistical Commission in New York. The same applies for the targets on rule of law and reduction of corruption. And the process is basically, as far as I see it, that there are certain indicators, so-called official indicators, that governments have agreed on in the UN Statistical Commission. And these are mainly so-called objective indicators, so indicators that are produced, for example, by statistical offices, like numbers on health developments. And as you know, democracy is very difficult to measure, or the things we care about with like so-called objective indicators. So that's why we suggested that as a substitute and as an addition to provide additional value to these official indicators, it might be useful, or it is useful for governments and NGOs to pull out the VDEM data to monitor progress that governments have been doing on accountability, for example, responsiveness. And we've also published, as VDEM Institute, a series of policy briefs where we detail that exactly how this can happen. And also UNDP has published a huge publication. It's called a virtual source book. On the Sustainable Development Goals, where also a lot of additional indicators are featured that can be used to track progress on particularly these accountability and democracy relevant aspects of the SDGs. So I think that's exactly one of the reasons and uses that we have for collecting all this massive amount of data.
Joe, so just to follow up on that, this means that there are actually quite a few aspects of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that we'd also capture with our database. So we cannot decide, of course, what the public use of this data will be, but citizens and civil society organizations and so on can make the same connection between our indicators and the Sustainable Development Goals and try to hold their governments accountable on this basis.
Yes. And whilst we're waiting for the foreign minister to arrive, we might have time for a few additional questions, but before we do that, could I please ask the audience to move forward a little bit? It's just that it's so dispersed right now that it feels like we would like to have you closer. Also, a little bit of movement is always a good thing after sitting down for a whole day. So please come forward.
The bodyguards will kick us off stage. No, let them maybe come with some questions.
So I heard there was one more question here in the audience. Yes?
Hello.
Okay.
Please, let me ask a very short and rather rhetorical question. Is there any prospect of indices for equality?
Yes, of course. You want?
Yeah. So actually, that is some of what we see as a potential addition with our data set. So under social rights and equality, we have what we call subcomponent indices also, where we have social equality, where trying to tap into the level of discrimination in society, and we have gender equality. Do we have other subcomponents under this one?
No, only these two.
I don't think so, but of course, equality with respect to what, you can ask, because all of this comes down to equality with respect to popular control and political equality, which is kind of the basic principles of democracy. But what is also not clear from this nice overview is that also under civil liberties we have sub-components that people can look deeper into. So we have freedom of religion, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and personal integrity and security as sub-components. So this is even on an aggregate level what we show here. And of course, all the data that comes into this, the raw data and all the procedures and so on, are publicly available on the web page. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question? Yeah.
Thank you. First, I would like to say that I think it's kind of sad that only male are making question. Half of the population of the world are females, so I hope some females will make questions as well, because gender empowerment is something that all of us win on, not just women, but also we men, as much as you. That was my first point. All right, having said that, my name is Anny Dervishi. I've been doing and promoting democracy in many parts of the world, in Sweden as well as Eastern Europe where I was born, the Balkans and Kosovo, nowadays independent country, and also in Asia and Africa. My question was, reading through the whole report, there's one thing I was missing. Have you guys thought about the cross-sectoral way of thinking? Let's say in majority of the countries, 50% of the population there are women, and many of them the young people, and then many people with disabilities, and having connection with the immigrants, which is part of that as well. These groups that I just pointed out, like women, young people, and people with disabilities, usually they are 70–80% of a country's inhabitants. However, with regards to decision making, they are not even 20 or 30%. We all know that, right? So usually it's not them taking the decision or the main stakeholders. Have you thought about having kind of cross-sectoral, if I may call it so, including those groups in one united efforts? I think you do understand my point.
Yeah.
And I'm really sure, being not born here as I did introduce myself, I know what kind of reality the immigrants are facing, especially having in mind populism in nowadays in Europe. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, this is a really good question. And yes, this is something we have thought about. But all types of underrepresentation or discrimination and so on would be relevant for us to capture here. The big problem, however, has been that there's simply not data available to make a nuanced measurement of this. So you would have data for a few countries, for a few years, but nothing that would compare to what we have for these other aspects. So unfortunately not.
Okay, great. Thank you very much to Sven Erik and to Claudio for being available for questions and answers on your indices. And I really hope that they will be a source for policymakers and academics alike in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Anna Luhrmann from the Vidam Institute. It is a truly remarkable goldmine, the new State of Democracy Indices. Now, we're very happy and honored to have with us the Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Margot Wallstrm. She will share a Swedish perspective on the global state of democracy and maybe the challenges and opportunity it is facing. Foreign Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear friends. This is always risky to come in the middle of something that hopefully has been going on here for quite some time, discussions that I am not, of course, fully aware of all the nuances in your debate about democracy. But I will try to, first of all, I want to say that I'm pleased to see so many people gathered to discuss the state of democracy and the challenges that democracy is facing today, but also talk about all the opportunities that it presents. And I have to start by saying that I want to underline the paramount importance that democracy has in Sweden's foreign policy, because democracy, human rights, and the rule of law make up a very strong entity that is mutually reinforcing and dependent on each other. And at the same time, I remember from my time in IDEA that we always used to say democracy cannot be exported, it can only be supported. And I don't know if all the theories and the discussions here today have given proof to that statement, but I believe it's very much the truth around the world. Democracy is a complex affair, for sure, that it must include a combination of electoral principles, deliberative and participatory components, liberal rights, and not least a reasonable level of equality. And only when these perspectives work together can democracy truly flourish. And this shows that democratic rights are also duties. Citizens must engage and participate in civil society, media, debates, demonstrations, and so on. And democracy cannot grow in a society where you only contribute by voting every 4 or 5 years. And that's an insight that we I think also see demonstrated, or a truth that we see demonstrated over and over again in many countries. I would like to briefly touch on three different perspectives. First, the Swedish human rights reports and the trend of shrinking spaces and meaning for NGOs and civil society also around the world. The necessity of women and youth in democracies, their participation, the European Union, and growing populism. And you know that we sort of restarted the tradition, in this government restarted the tradition of issuing reports on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And this time we decided to do it for sort of covers most of the world, and it means that we have issued 135 country reports on the state of democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And this was published earlier this year, and I can tell you that it means that our embassies and all our diplomatic representation has really done a wonderful job, because so far, also when we publish them or when we talk about them, when we present them, we have not heard much of criticism, but it is a solid work that has been put into those reports. And we are only one out of, a couple of countries in the world that actually do this. And it's for the first time that they have this democracy component. And we see a clear trend where a growing number of states limit the space available to civil society in various ways. And this is, of course, very worrying, because a vibrant and pluralistic civil society and the free media, they are essential elements for a democracy. And governments are increasingly persecuting organizations and individuals fighting for their freedoms of expression, assembly, and opinion. And in some traditionally democratic countries too, we have seen backsliding from democratic governance and the space for civil society decrease. And not the least have we seen this among European Union member states, where young but until now stable democracies are showing authoritarian tendencies as well. And according to the Global Civil Society Alliance, Civicus, ratings for October 2017, only 2% of the world's population today live in a country with a completely open civic space. So that's a very serious sign. And having a strong civil society is the foundation of all functioning democracies. And we can see that it coincides with when the shrinking space, we can see that it coincides with the declining democracy. And we've seen it in Cambodia, we've seen it in Turkey, we've seen it in Poland and Venezuela, of course, now being just a few examples. We continue to put ourselves in the forefront of fighting the causes of shrinking space, and we work in the UN Security Council, we work in the UN Human Rights Council and other UN agencies on this topic. And we think that the European Union is an important player also in promoting human rights issues around the world, but also among member states. An area of more positive but slow development is women's rights. And we have, as you know, over the last 3 years proclaimed that we are a feminist government and that we also pursue a feminist foreign policy. And the aim is, of course, to promote women as actors in all spheres of society. And this includes increasing women's political representation and empowerment. And as pointed out in the Global State of Democracy report, at current rates of progress, political equality between men and women will not be achieved until 2060. Do we want to wait that long for this to happen? And even we can see in some countries where women's political representation is going down. For example, I spoke to a colleague. We have a network of women foreign ministers, and as much as you would wish that this was not necessary, that we have to meet and discuss issues that actually concern women in particular, but this is still the case. For example, violence against women, domestic violence against women, or also how women can play a role in when it comes to security policy, or the fact that when women run as candidates, they are often exposed to a lot of hatred and threats, of course, on social media, but also how they are depicted. And this has become increasingly a problem, that they are bad-mouthed, of course, and that they are really pressurized by everybody, also by colleagues, and very often asked to actually withdraw their candidature. And this seems to be a kind of new phenomenon that increases also the pressure on women candidates, and make many of them not wanting to run for parliament or what have you. And when I talked to one of my colleagues who is the foreign minister of Liechtenstein, she said that in the last parliamentary election, the number of women went down. So, and considerably so. So on the contrary to what we are hoping, or that we would like to see, the women representation is going down. Maybe because of this, I don't know exactly what is the explanation in that country, but I hear so many of these problems being described. This is, of course, unacceptable that we would have to wait that long. Women represent half of the world's population. They have a right to be represented. Madeleine Albright has said that development without democracy is improbable. Democracy without women is impossible. And that is true. It is a truly democratic argument. Gender equality is a fundamental matter of human rights, democracy, and social justice, but overwhelming evidence shows that it is also a precondition for sustainable growth, welfare, peace, and security. And societies where women are not thriving will not prosper. It's as simple as that. Young people, and we've never had so many young people living on this planet ever, proportionately. The young continues to be underrepresented in most elected parliaments. Even though many countries have a very young population, they still fail in representation. And this is also worrisome and risks creating a gap between aging politicians that does not take sustainable decisions for future generations, and young, frustrated voters that are not represented. And I think you will recognize that description in some countries also around the world. I think new initiatives are necessary to guarantee youth representation. And I come from a political party that decided to set a goal of 25% under 35 years of age at all election lists for our latest election. And I think ideas like this need to be encouraged and more widely used. And I believe in quotas overall. I think that this is a very useful tool to counter also what is today de facto discrimination also against women, for example. My third and final point, and not to speak too long to you, I know you've had also a busy day and you're waiting for other things to happen, but you can also see that democracy in the European Union is under attack from populism and, should we call it, extremism. An increasing number of people today are losing confidence in conventional politics and also questioning the value of democracy. And the risk of populism, disinformation and racism that we are seeing today, not least in Europe, will test democracy's resilience in coming years. And we need to focus our attention to prevent further backsliding and work even harder to show the benefits of living in open, free societies where democracy reigns. And in this regard, we must show that democracy does not only voice the opinion of a few, but guarantees decisions promoting economic growth and equal opportunities for the larger public. And many people may rarely view their voice their political views, but are counting on democratically elected politicians to deliver an effective government and rule of law. And decreasing inequality is essential to regain support for politicians and fighting populism. It is also one of the global development goals and thus a globally recognized priority. And I think the European Union has an important role to play in this regard and should lead with example. And may I say, and this is to complicate issues a bit, but it is also the role of using referenda, because as was the case also on Brexit, when politicians did not, and this is my view on this, I think it was really bad leadership, when leaders did not stand up to defend their EU membership or explain to citizens and voters what that meant, that they were a member of the European Union. In the end, they called for a referendum. And they did that without mobilizing all the information necessary or to make sure that there was knowledge enough, that there was full participation, that you could get correct information about what the different alternatives were. And then you had the result as we saw it in Brexit. But it was also an example of how you must not misuse what is often seen as the ultimate tool of democracy, and that is to ask all people to vote on a certain issue. I think you can create enormous problems by using referenda also. You divide people, you force them to take a simple yes or no vote or vote for two alternatives on often very, very complicated issues. And it is also a way to abdicate for politicians sometimes, to say, well, let's use a referendum and maybe hope that people will move in one or the other direction because of arguments that are not always presented properly. And I think one has to also issue a warning against thinking about this as a simple way to exercise fully democracy. It is not necessarily so. And I think remember that those divides will also live on in a society, I would say, for generations. We still can recall, some of us, at least at my age, we can recall when we voted on nuclear energy in this country. And that divided families, it divided political parties, it divided different contexts and gatherings of people. And I think that it is also a wound to society if you do it not in a correct way, but with just avoiding taking full responsibility by the elected politicians. So but that's an extra, a little detour. So I think that working for continuous dialogue on democracy is important in also preventing it from backsliding. And today's event, organized by IDEA, is a good example and a contribution to that end. And IDEA's global state of democracy and its indices is an instrument that will be, I think, a valuable tool for policymakers, civil society, and individuals engaged in democratic development across the globe. And therefore, I would like to take this opportunity also to convey my warmest congratulations to all the staff at the International IDEA for producing a thorough, timely and relevant publication. And as anti-democratic forces gain foothold around the world, closer cooperation between governments, international organizations and civil society will form the basis for our defense. And lastly, as you know, this Monday, Sweden qualified for next year's World Cup in football. But in contrast to football, democracy is not a spectator sport, and it needs everyone's participation. And I encourage each and everyone in this room and beyond to join the game. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister. Thank you very much for taking time in your busy schedule. You have now the freshly printed report in your hand, both the full long version, 300-something pages, and the shorter version, depending on how much time you have. But thank you again for joining us and for those, yes, for those. And now, after these extremely thought-provoking remarks, it is time to see if any thought-provoking new ideas were generated in the Ideathon labs earlier today. As you know, the purpose of the labs was to find some practical, innovative solutions based on the recommendations that we have in the Global State of Democracy report. Because we didn't just want to make global statements and global recommendations, we actually also wanted to allow you to be part of this change and to, like the Foreign Minister just said, not be a spectator, but actually be a player, a democracy player. So now it is time to hear from the first lab and to see what solutions they had for a better integration of young people in political processes. I understand that it is Victor and Sarah from Östra Real Gymnasium High School who are going to come up on stage and present the ideas. And then, in the spirit of democracy, we will all vote for the best solution.
Yes. So, hi. My name is Sara Abdullah. I'm 18 years old, and I represent Östra Real from a high school. This is also Victor Törnlund, also 18. We are going to represent the youth lab today. Our task today was to figure out two solutions, one realistic idea and one dream idea, to engage youth in the political process. I am going to represent the realistic solution. So the average age in our group was 23. Yeah. Our proposal was to have political parties come and speak to schools in a more effective way. So the targeted audience are schools, students, also 16 years old and upwards. The messages is to facilitate dialogue, to allow the students to ask questions, to allow political parties to represent their idea and policies to students more in an effective way, but also to allow students to give their opinion on what is important as a youth, to allow them to be a part of the process. The way that we are going to communicate the message is through every school should have these dialogues as an activity. What we are going to need to have this activity and to communicate is the cooperation of the schools, the contact and cooperation with the parties and the politicians, access to a big room for presenting, and moderator and organizers for the event. Well, who do you need for these activities is going to be the politicians, teachers, students, and the schools then. When are we going to have these activities? The idea was to have it continuous, so before, after, and during elections. Once or twice a semester was the thought. Why do you need this communicate this message is, well, first of all, there's a disconnection between the political parties and students, and the current format isn't effective that we have today. It just isn't working. Well, what could go wrong? Well, a few things. Some schools, especially from lower socio and economic backgrounds, could be left out of this initiative. Politicians drive and they can take over the program. Politicians may not have the time or see the reason to engage. It won't be the same event in every school, so the message might change because every school have a different representative from different political parties, so the message might change. And there might not be a balance of the parties' policies to represent. So if every political party aren't going to engage in the activity, the message aren't going to be wide enough. So, and this idea could be also used for other countries, for other audiences, and for other subjects. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, so we got the task to answer the question if what to do to raise the youth political participation in our society. And we were 5 people in my group, and we like proposed a dream solution, like in a scenario where we have like all the assets that we need, and yeah. And the median age of our group was 24, and yeah. Visualize this: Zlatan standing in front of a crowd, a huge crowd. The crowd consists of a variety of famous Swedish artists, representing all different kinds of music styles. With each music hero, there is a fan base. And what this fan base has in common is their love for Sweden. Together, everybody starts to sing the Swedish national anthem. And when the song is finished, Zlatan kicks the ball and he says, "The ball is in your court." And like the main idea behind this was to raise the political awareness among youth and inspire political and to inspire political and to broaden the perception of politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Victor. I don't think I would have been thinking of this solution myself, but it's a good one for promotion. Maybe somebody here has the contact for Zlatan, so we can ask him if he would be willing to accept that opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to try and vote for one of those 2 solutions. And we're going to try and do it online. We're going to use a tool called Mentimeter. So I would like everybody that has a smartphone to pick it up. And then we're going to do a little test vote first, just to see the technology is on our side. So we're going to answer a non-democracy related question first. So if we can just see what the different options were. So yes, so the question is, what is your favorite pizza topping? So please go to menti.com and then use the code 875877. See if it's working. It's almost as exciting as in a real election, right? Before the results come in. Oh. Okay, well, it seems to have worked. 51% preferred another topic than the 2 proposed one, and there were 7 in the audience who didn't like pizza. Really? Okay, great. Now, let's go back to the two proposals from the Youth Lab. The first one being political parties going to schools and having more dialogue with the students. And the second one being creating, if I understand correctly, a promotional video whereby Zlatan would, together with other famous Swedish artists, would encourage others to take action for democracy. Now I'm wondering if the second proposal isn't gaining so much ground because the Swedish national team managed to make it to the World Cup without Zlatan, or... Okay. Well, it seems like the more realistic proposal is gaining ground. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your ideas. It seems like we should try and push for more political parties to visit schools. I know that this is done in Sweden, especially before the elections, but I do agree that it's a very good point that democratic participation is not just about voting and it's not just about being active during elections, but it's also about keeping engaged and trying to influence politicians to be the representatives that they should be. Now to the second lab, which dealt with a very topical issue, I think particularly in Europe, but around the world, the issue of migration. So if we can have a representative from the migration lab joining me up on stage. Is it Lina? Yes.
Spirit of inclusion.
Very well. You have microphones here on stage. Welcome up on stage.
But first of all, let me say something that is very telling of our group. First of all, we were 17 people of about 12 different countries of origin. We broke up into 3 different subgroups and we developed 3 different project proposals. And in the end, when we came together and we announced our proposals to each other, we realized that our proposals are very similar, as you will find out now. And I think this is very telling, that you have 3 different groups that have not coordinated among themselves and come up with very similar proposal. In my view, it tells that there is a need for this proposal to be implemented. Come along.
We're proposal number 3, and like Lena mentioned, we actually had very similar proposals to the other 2 groups. The concept of our proposal was to respond to a couple of different challenges that are facing the improvement of political participation of migrants in Sweden. One of those was anti-immigrant groups and narratives, including disinformation, so the perceptions that people have about migrants and migration. Another one was the lack of cooperation and coordination between different stakeholders who are working to improve the political participation of migrants. And the last one was ineffective management of integration programs and resources. So the solution that we put forward was establishing a hub to coordinate migrant political and civic participation initiatives that are undertaken by public institutions and civil society organizations at the national and municipal level.
So the idea of this is that it would create a forum or a place where civil society and different actors can engage. So it would create a sort of natural platforms where both migrants or natives can engage and see different alternatives when it comes to civil society. And the idea is that this would help people navigate the landscape of different options and also provide an apolitical platform to oversee different initiatives in the municipal level.
There were three primary objectives of this project. The first was to improve coordination between public institutions at the national and municipal levels and civic organizations. The second was to increase engagement between public and civic actors that are working to increase political and civic participation among migrants. And the last was to increase the civic and political participation of migrants themselves through improved coordination and engagement. So, yeah, I think that's all.
Hello everyone, my name is Alice Hertzberg and I'm going to start by presenting our idea. The name of our project is Partnership for Participation, and our slogan is initiated locally and coordinated nationally. And we want to start by saying that participation is a human right, but today there are several barriers that hinders migrants with different legal statuses to participate politically. And as we have said during the day, political participation is not only voting, but it's participation on different levels, and we want to enable that with our ID. You want to?
In addition to that, the lack of coordination and engagement of different stakeholders is actually hindering the participation of migrants and people with migrant backgrounds. So the idea is basically to build a partnership between or a co-management system for a body that is composing of local authorities on one side, local businesses, and also local civil society that also includes unions and self-organized civil society migrant organizations. And together, this board or this partnership that is initiated locally and coordinated nationally will basically create the preconditions, create the environment that is necessary for migrant participation on a local level, but also on a national level. If you want to add something. So, yeah.
I don't know. Do we have more time?
We can talk about scalability.
Which one? Let's see. Yeah. So I think we talked about like civic education and participation is the most important thing, and that we recognize everyone, like the agency of migrants or regardless of your status. And we think like maybe the challenges might be on the one hand that there are already so many networks doing this and having this partnership and doing amazing things. But we think that we need like on a more national level that we need to coordinate, because businesses and different organizations, think tanks and so on, organizations have so many great ideas on how we can make more participation or better integration, but we don't have enough cooperation and maybe legal frameworks that hinder this sometimes. So we think this could enable that.
Yeah, and basically the idea with this partnership that will work on directing the resources and the support for the people who are grassroots and the people who are on the field. Because right now, most of the support for civil society is going for big organizations or for well-established, well-known organizations, while the small organizations, the grassroots organizations, the migrant organizations are actually facing a lot of multi-layers of difficulties to actually participate. So one of the main responsibility for such a partnership would be to overcome this. Also, we thought about what kind of scalability that we can use, making use of the local resources that are on a local level, but also on a national level, that we would focus on the history of Sweden being on the forefront of democracy and democratic practices. We also thought about the relationship between, or the correlation between participation and mental health of migrants and how social participation can help overcome previous memories and previous trauma. So what kind of relationship between participation and post-traumatic growth? Yeah, okay, thanks.
Hello, everyone. So this is group number 3, or third.
One. We are the group number
1, but third one. Yes.
Yeah, the other way around.
Yes. So our idea was that we would go ahead with suggesting the creation of multi-party consultative committees for grassroots decision-making processes. That's what we called it. And the motto that we came up with is funds from the top, solutions from the bottom. Right?
Yeah.
Right, so it's catchy and down to the point. And the idea is that as a problem statement, essentially it is the lack of political representation and or participation of legal migrants in decision-making and political processes in Sweden. You know, that was sort of the idea, which is associated with the lack of knowledge, political or otherwise, associated with discrimination, issues of integration, issues of education, and so on and so forth. So the overarching problem is the lack of political participation and representation. Some of the objectives that we sort of agreed upon is to support financially and with other resources migrant groups at the local level, at the commune level. Delegate, under second point, delegate decision-making powers at the local level as well. Engage with local grassroots civil society organizations to reach out to migrant communities, and also to initiate the establishment, which is perhaps one of the main points, the creation or the establishment of a department or a division within a certain ministry at the local, at the central level, that would be in charge of supporting and cooperating with and creating links between the migrant communities as well as the local residents at the local level. So the idea is that we create, basically we advocate for the creation of a central department that would provide political support and also essentially financial support for the inclusion and the integration of non-Swedish residents, and that would delegate a lot of that responsibility for offices around the country at the commune level to work together at the grassroots level with civil society organizations, migrants or otherwise, to reach out and bridge those gaps between different communities. And hence the motto that I mentioned before. Anybody else? Anything else?
Just to add up, really, some more things that we went over. Actually, there are a lot of initiatives on so many different levels. And the reason that we wanted to come up with a governmental branch, a division, is to make sure that they are tuned with each other. And at the same time, we talked about internalizing the need for democracy and why people should take part in democratic process. And we thought maybe there can be some educational meetings. Local schools can be used for this as buildings during the weekends, and people can come together, be it the local administrations or the political parties, can provide some help on democratic awareness, maybe, and once individuals are more aware of their democratic, the need to take part in the democratic process, it will be gradually easier to take part, first in the local level, and then hopefully in further, more sophisticated levels. And then we also talked about the obstacles that might arise, and it seems like the major obstacle in that kind of a voluntary or inspirational project is to lose motivation. In our group, we thought that the civil society and the everyday individual lives of people should be integrated in such a process. And if people and institutions lose motivation of that kind of cooperation and working together, that's the greatest danger. So we should always keep some carrot, so to speak, in the process to make it more attractive for all the partners that take part to continue this process.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that is
Let's go all this way.
number one.
Right. Now, you know, normally you get to vote every 4 years. Now you will get to vote 4 times in one event. So we take this active participation very seriously. Now, please go to the menti.com page again. And the code this time is 313138. Isn't it amazing to see how you yourself can influence these bars just by adding your own vote? It's still changing a bit, but it's crystallizing that the second proposal got slightly more votes than the first one. But they're all very close, so very well done, the entire team. I think that a lot of people, not just in Sweden, but in other countries as well, will be able to use the ideas generated today, because as we mentioned before, we're going to put them on Ideas website once we've managed to edit them, because this is not just for Sweden, this is for the entire world, and you will also be able to inspire others in other ideathons that will be held. And we mentioned, I think, earlier that we will have 14 launches in total. So this is the first one. So there will be also opportunities for your ideas to help others to innovate their own solution. Now I would like to welcome the participants from the third lab, which is the one dealing with political participation and new forms of engagement, to join me up on stage. And I know that there were 2 solutions this time that you would like to present. Let's see who... And I would also ask the presenters to be quite brief, since we're almost running out of time.
Okay, hi. So our group, we sort of discussed 2 main issues from the perspective of political parties. So one was the lack of understanding of what attracts engagement. Sorry, is it better? Okay. So the first thing we discussed was from the political parties' perspective, was the lack of understanding of what attracts engagement, and also problems with communication or how they package their messages. So our objective was not only to think about what parties can do to increase engagement, but also maintain. Okay, sorry. So our idea was to create a broader sense of community around parties by having more meetings, instead of one big national assembly once a year, having more meetings and more assemblies at local level throughout the year. And also using subgroups within the parties to create horizontal power structures, so the parties are not perceived as being top-down, having a very fixed hierarchy. Also using mentorship and training programs which creates a network of personal connections within the parties and helps to bring new people in and assimilate them better within the party culture. It also makes the internal structure of the party more accessible. As for implementation, we thought about using a party's existing structure, also of subgroups and focal groups, such as women's initiatives and environmental initiatives, to engage better with the community and lower the barriers as a first step into the party. And as for communications, we believe that the parties should have a very clear shared vision of what they believe, a vision for the society, and that should be the underlying thread through their policies and all their communications. That's it.
Hi. So our group also discussed political participation. Our solution was also a bit related to the previous group, but it slightly goes in a different direction. So our leading question was how to make political parties more representative. And we were looking at Almedalen, which for the non-Swedes is 1 week at the beginning of summer, where representatives from major political parties take turn in making speeches. So we would like to not copy-paste Almedalen, but we would like to find inspiration. And we would like to organize a series of dialogue meetings or forums that not only take place once a year, but take place 3 times a year, 4 times a year, and not only in one location, but they can take place anywhere in Sweden, but also outside Sweden, in any country, basically. And the role of those dialogue meetings or forums is to bring together, as well as people from civic society, from the society, also marginalized groups, closer to politicians. But we do not want to create an environment where politicians just promote their political agenda. We want to have it a very open discussion where these meetings are arranged around certain topics that are related to the concerns of the people sitting in the room. So, for instance, we can have migration, which was also discussed here earlier, and we can have it as a topic, and we can have where political parties can say, okay, these are the challenges that we're facing at a societal level, at a local level, in your community, in your neighborhoods, and this is how we're thinking to tackle them. And it cannot just be one political party, but it can be members from different political parties talking about how they want to find solutions to problems that are really close to people. And by this, we want to increase the participation in a political way from people who do not feel included in the political process. That we want to avoid that people feel that they are being listened to just before elections, and again, they have to wait 4 to 5 years before their voice can be heard. So we would like to organize such events. Thank you. Yes, Almedalen more often is a good idea. I think that this is what they tried also with Järvaveckan earlier this year. Now for the last vote, for the third lab, once more I would ask you to take out your mobile phones and go to menti.com using the code 935354. When I look at these results, I'm thinking, which election does this most closely look like? It's very, very close. It means that you really like both of them. Yet again, well done. Very close. Thank you. Now for the last lab that we had on inequality and the more provocative question, can democracy counter it? And I think it's going to be my colleague Victoria Perotti, who's going to present the solutions that were generated. Solution.
Yes. We're presenting one solution because we chose something that was common to the three groups that we had, and then we built it on that. We built on that. So the problem that the project is called Visualizing Inequalities, and the problem that we reacted to is actually put in one of our infographics, that 8 people own as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population. So what we wanted to do is to provide data on inequalities, creating initiatives like Gapminder, to create dialogue and solidarity beyond numbers, with a view to change the economic order. So the objective is to increase knowledge, influence, values, and perceptions on inequalities. And the beneficiaries, or the target group, would be the public and private decision makers. In terms of the activities, we were thinking about developing web-based tools, databases, and local-level dialogue. Short and sweet.
Thank you, Victoria. You don't need to vote if you only have one great solution. To round up the day, we have the honor to welcome up on stage and to have with us the former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and the current chairperson of SIPRI, Mr. Jan Eliasson.
Thank you very much, Adina. I think you've been a very good moderator, very cool, very controlled. I suggested that she would run the Oscars next year, but she preferred to go to the United Nations, the European Union. Well, I don't know in which order you will do it, but I'm sure you will. And great to be with you. I have been asked by International IDEA to be ambassador. I'm very glad for that promotion. Thank you very much. Of this IDEA venture, the new yearly and biannual, I suppose, enlightenment on the state of democracy around the world. I am very impressed by what you've been doing. I listened to the presentation of the Indices. Really very, very good. I suddenly realized that I had a systematic mind of what it contains, but you have really made that clear today, so thank you very much. And also, I was so impressed by the young people here who spoke, first of all, analytically extremely well, but also extremely good English. So I was asking whether you were English or Americans, but you're evidently from Australia. Is that correct? Fantastic. Good. Keep it up. Keep it up. Everybody has to know at least 3 languages fluently in today's world, so it's a challenge for you to go for the 3rd one. Now, I think this is very good to do this type of presentation. I am chair of SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and we do this on armaments. And it has become a yearbook which is used as a standard work all over. And many nations are pretty worried, but we come out with evidence-based facts, and in today's world that is precious. And I think it is very good that you enter this territory of going through a special sector which is important for nations but also for the international community, and keep the awareness very high on the road forward. I think the good news, there is good news. There is good news, the number of democracies in the world. There is good news in terms of participation. There are definitely a lot of good news. I skimmed through the summary recently, and there's no doubt about that. So let's not fall into deep depression. Also, I find what we did at the United Nations, I was Deputy Secretary General, as you said, Adina, over the last 5 years. I'm pretty proud of the Sustainable Development Goals. I was also president of the UN General Assembly 2005 and 2006, where we worked out the golden formula for international cooperation, as you may know, where we stated in the beginning of that summit document, there is no peace without development, there is no development without peace, and there is no lasting development or peace without respect of human rights. And that to me includes democracy, of course. And the fact that we have put these three together, three pillars that are on which stability and progress rest, means that we have to make sure that we work hard on all three: strengthen peace, strengthen development, and strengthen human rights in order to have a stable development. My experience from having visited altogether 104 countries, I think, is that when you see that one of these pillars is weak, the whole structure is weak. It's like an infection that goes through societies if you don't tend to all three almost simultaneously in order to really have a positive development ahead of you. So, good news, yes, of course. But in my view, I will be very open with you. I think there is also a lot of bad news, or at least worrying news. I find the trends the last few years pretty disturbing in how, not least the traditional democracies are not seeing the dangers of the polarization, division that goes on, and the fact that even those who spread hatred and division are politically rewarded. Of course, we have free debate, we have everything that are the trademarks of democracy, but when you come to the point that you openly propose discrimination and divide people and use the fear factor that is playing such an important role in today's world in order to even reduce the value of democracy in terms of, you can see it in forms of detention of people, you can see it in how civil society's space is shrinking, you can see it in something extremely dangerous in my view, namely the attacks on the traditional media. I am often in the United States, New York, Washington. I meet friends from New York Times, CNN, The New Yorker, and they feel that they are under attack. They are even called by the President of the United States enemies of the people. And statistical or surveys have shown recently that almost half of the American people are taking their news from Facebook or social media and not at all, they're not aware at all of what goes on in the media in the West and East Coast of the United States. So the battle might not even, well, the battle might already be won by that side. I'm a great friend of modern media, social media. I think it's great. It has done a fantastic thing in terms of spreading knowledge and information around the world. When I was mediating in 6 conflicts, as I have done in my life, I've been around in the Middle East and Africa, and people in those countries didn't even know what was going on outside their own countries. So this little thing is a blessing from that perspective. But you can also see how hate speech and other phenomena has increased the pace of information to an extreme degree, almost creating a hysterical pace of information. And also, what I would say, now this is my subjective reflection, so you may dispute, but I feel also that there is a situation of rising expectations, which is extreme. When you talked to recently one of the groups here about the elections, the next period, waiting for the next election, it's not always the instinct. We have now expectations that are such that in today's world we live in societies very often where there is a need for instant gratification, immediate results. let me give you an example of, let's say, the changes in Egypt. Mubarak was deposed. Morsi came in. He was given, 10, 11 months, a year. People were expecting immediate results, economic and social change, and results out there in their living standards. If that didn't happen, then it was very easy for Sisi to come into power. The normal instinct to wait for the democratic cycle, something will happen in 3 or 4 years, isn't there. So therefore we have to really make sure that we go back to evidence-based facts and accept a little bit of a slower, contemplative process of coming to important decisions in societies. This hysterical pace is not good for us. And I think democracy has to now prove its value and standing. And I don't know. When I left New York, I met people from Asia, Africa, who said, listen, we were educated in London, Paris, New York, United States. We believe you, we understand the Western democracy model is the best one, but I'll tell you what, we don't find that that support is as solid as it was in the past. China, Russia, Turkey, Egypt, well, it's another type of society. So don't take it for granted. And if this democratic process for which you are so proud produces leadership of the kind that you've seen, I'm quoting them, in the United States, this was a month after the election in the US, and we were waiting for results from France later on. Le Pen was ahead, or at least very high up in the polls. They said, there's not too much for you to brag about. So I think we have a huge challenge to really stand up for democracy, for human rights, and come back to some of these basic elements of a decent dialogue, because there are so many signs right now that are disturbing. And I think we need a mobilization of good forces. Good forces to stand up for those basic values, at least the ones that I was raised with, and also feel those vibrations in the ground that we are seeing around us, not only in the United States, but definitely also in Europe. And you can measure that very much on different categories of people. I'm glad you in the Migration Refugees Group came up with models of participation from your side, because that's where you can always measure when an exposed, vulnerable group is not dealt with in a fair way, or risks coming in that category that you have to start acting. So I just want to say to you that, first of all, to IDEA and its staff, excellent staff, how good work you've done, that this has a deep significance today. It wasn't hard, as you know, to convince me to be ambassador. I've had the job for I don't know how many years, 30 years, but now I'm honorary ambassador of IDEA. And I will be on your side. And I'm glad there are so many young people who are here, and I think we should work along the concept that we young people have to stick together. So thank you very much.
Jan, before you head down, I just want to... Jan, before you head down...
Oh, thank you very much.
I have...
Night reading.
Yes, short or long version, depending on how tired you are. I know you've had a very long day. Now, after this very lucid, both optimistic and realistic perspective on the global state of democracy, the opportunities and challenges it is facing, I would like to conclude this conference by thanking all the participants, the speakers, for your time, engagement, and valuable contributions. I would like to thank the Swedish government for their support, our external experts and consultants, the Varieties of Democracies Institute, but also Prime Group, who helped us develop these beautiful films that you saw earlier, and Phoenix Design Aid, who designed both the printed and the digital version of the publication, and then also the database. Last but not least, I would also like to thank all my colleagues at IDEA who helped and supported us throughout these 2 years of developing this publication, and who came with good advice and who pushed us, who encouraged us, and who also kept us on the right track. And of course, also Nathalie Ebert, who led this team. And last but not least, I would also like to especially thank the admin staff who helped organize this event. Now, in my opinion, and this is my personal opinion, it takes knowledge, courage, and actions to safeguard democracy. Knowledge to know what you have and what is at stake. Courage to stand up for your convictions and get involved. And actions, because in the end, this is what will make a difference. Democracy doesn't happen by chance. We all need to do our part to protect and advance it. Thank you very much for coming today.